everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Reed Coverdale, and you're watching The Naturalist Capitalist. Sorry, it's been a few weeks since my last video. Just moved out west, got a new job, but trying to keep up with it. Today on the show, I've got Dack Rouleau with me. How you doing, Dack?
I'm as perky as a rat in liverwurst. How are you?
I'm doing well. So you're a pretty interesting person. I got to know you on Tulsi Gabbard's campaign a little bit. We got to talk a lot. Just tell us a little bit about who you are, about the overwritten report, about your interviews you've had with politicians, and then specifically about your question about Assange that you put to a dozen or so candidates.
Well, I'm in the process of writing a book about my experiences on the Democratic Party campaign trail. I was just getting ready to leave for Bangkok on a vacation when I got the news that Julian Assange had been arrested. And while I was in Bangkok, I had been ruminating on this quite a bit because Bangkok, as some of your viewers may know, does not have freedom of expression, freedom of democratic process, freedom of journalism, etc. And while I was in Bangkok, I realized that I was coming to a crossroads in my life, and I had three options on where I could go. I could either commit suicide, I could become an English teacher in Bangkok, or I could return to America and start to try to make a difference in the country to the best of my ability. Foolishly, I chose the third option, and I decided to follow the Democratic Party presidential candidates around as they terrorized the state of New Hampshire, and I decided to terrorize them by asking them where they stood on the issue of Julian Assange, because it came to my attention that for some inexplicable reason, the corporate media neglected to ask such a question.
And what was the response? I think you only got one affirmation from a candidate that they would pardon him, right? And then a couple sort of waffled, but most were just a flat out no.
Well, Tulsi Gabbard said that she would drop the charges against Julian Assange. That's a relevant point, that she did not say she would pardon him because he has not committed a crime, as far as we are aware. She said that she would pardon Edward Snowden, who did commit a crime, but of course for the right reasons. We got a kind of positive answer out of Marianne Williamson, and I think it was, it was Tom Steyer who had indicated lukewarm support for these people who are raising awareness about certain government surveillance programs. Everyone else was an absolute dud, either refusing to answer the question, pretending they knew nothing about it, or outright saying that he was not a person that they support. I spent a few $1,000s on this. I wasted so many hours of my time going to these rallies. It added up being, all things considered, several days that I had spent out there just trying to get these fools on the record. And, I got a few hundred views out of it on Twitter and YouTube, but I thought it was the right thing to do. I mean, if the mainstream media can't do its job, I might as well fill the gap. And it was good to, I really liked how I got a lot of Andrew Yang fans who told me how devastated they were and how they weren't going to support the candidate anymore. That showed that I got the job done. I enlightened them and said, these people are not on your side. They're fake progressives. Don't trust them.
Right. So I'm assuming a lot of my followers know about Julian Assange, but do you want to explain why that's such an important issue, that it goes beyond just Julian Assange, but it's about the idea of exposing what our government is doing, or just having a transparent process, is somehow considered treason, how dangerous that is?
Well, this country, which is, of course, hyper-jingoistic, this is a country that is, for some reason, reflexively intolerant to any kind of criticism of the American military, and by extension, the American military-industrial complex. The public has been trained to despise Julian Assange, to view him as some kind of cyber terrorist, as Joe Biden, the supposed progressive champion, described him. Assange's case... Assange, of course, founded WikiLeaks, which has specialized in publishing, I suppose you could call it digital contraband, information that governments and powerful institutions don't want us to know about. The American government has been pursuing him for the last decade because he released a video showing, surprise, surprise, shock of all shocks, American soldiers wantonly and recklessly murdering Iraqi civilians and foreign journalists quite some time ago. And while he was holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, fleeing persecution, torture, and possible execution, possibly even extrajudicial execution, Julian Assange continued to publish information that humiliated various powerful American and international corporations, including, of course, the Democratic Party, proving in 2016 that every cynical argument you have heard against voting turned out to be absolutely well-founded.
Right. So, what do you think the solution is? Do you think it's through voting, or do you think it's a revolution, or just trying to get everyone aware of what's going on, or like what do we do moving forward? Are we just fucked, or like?
Well, I'm reluctant to endorse revolution after the FBI stopped by my house. There's quite a few journalists out there who want to pretend that they're the victims of, international assassination schemes or some kind of persecution, but very few of them have the FBI standing in their living room, not 5 feet away from where I'm sitting and talking to you right now. So without getting into that, the thing is, democracy, I certainly don't believe in representative democracy. Mike Gravel wrote an interesting book called The Failure of Representative Government and the Solution. If we're going to be Democrats with a small d, we have to be supporters of direct democracy. But my view on this tends to be fueled not by modern day politicians, but by classical philosophers, pretty much everyone of whom I'm aware, at least in the Western tradition, had a lot of critical things to say about democracy. Plato felt that democracy was doomed to failure because he compared it to a boat being rowed by 20 different people in 20 different directions at once. You never get anywhere because you don't have a clear direction. Nietzsche observed that democracy was doomed to failure because if we as individuals are unable to organize our own lives, then what right do we presuppose to order the lives of people around us, including 320 million people, as would apply in the United States? So I'm skeptical of any attempt to control the situation democratically. But I'm also skeptical of the American people's, not only their ability to become enlightened and unplug from the matrix en masse, but also I question how much they really deserve that kind of liberation. I mean, does this country really deserve to recover from the plight in which it finds itself? It's a serious question. I mean, this country is responsible for so much horrific destruction and carnage throughout the entire world that I don't know that the country really deserves to be saved by one especially benevolent politician sweeping in and saving the day. I don't know that we really deserve that. I hate to sound like a Calvinist, but I think maybe there's a comeuppance that is waiting for us, and maybe we deserve to suffer just a little bit.
Do you think even if all the information were laid out before Americans, there was no media manipulation or lying, if all the facts were just laid out, do you think they'd even care? Because I feel like Americans are so ambivalent about everything anyways. I don't think a lot of people like to blame the media for all our misdirection, but I blame the citizens too. I think the citizens are equally as guilty in that, apathy. I don't think they care at all.
I wouldn't say that they're equally guilty. I think that they play an equal role because the media and these powerful institutions, they can produce misinformation, propaganda, etc. But that information is worthless in a vacuum. You have to have people who are going to swallow it and who are going to propagate it and who are going to think and live their lives according to that demented philosophy. And so I wouldn't say that the American people are guilty. I would say that they play an equally important role. But when you talk about what if there was no media manipulation, you're talking about the elimination of all these institutions. So in other words, if we reached the point that we're trying to arrive at, if we reached at that point, would things be different? Well, that's unfathomable. I mean, that's what Nietzsche talked about when he said that right now, in our present state of being, human beings are not nearly as evolved and as sophisticated as they need to be intellectually. So just like we cannot really compare ourselves to the Neanderthals because their cognitive abilities it's just unfair to them to compare their processes to ours. Someday there would come a point where humankind evolves and reaches a higher state of cognition that would make our present state of mind look utterly primitive. And so I can't imagine what that would be, but that is the first step. Once we rid ourselves of these institutions, then we would be able to have a productive conversation about who we ought to be.
Yeah. So, do you believe in uniting under a certain cause to make this happen, or is it just through individuals like you and I trying to get the information out there? Is there some sort of common anti-authoritarian cause we can all unite under to try to rid ourselves of these institutions and this government and the media, or do you think it's just kind of a hopeless mixed bag?
I wouldn't say it's hopeless. I would say that you have to start with yourself. You have to acknowledge how horrible you are as a person and see your own limitations and grotesqueries and try to overcome that. I am every day obsessed with my own grotesqueries, my own ugliness, my own flaws, my own worthlessness as a human being, which is why I try so hard to make myself better. But that kind of humility, if not self-deprecation, is obviously unappealing to most people, because if they see how ugly they are, soon they will start to realize how ugly the people around them are. And so if people are not able to have an honest conversation about themselves, then it doesn't really matter how hard they try to have an honest conversation about the society in which they live, because they can criticize other people, they can criticize the bourgeoisie, and they can criticize these institutions all day long, but by remaining deliberately ignorant about their own shortcomings, what they're essentially proving is that when they are given the opportunity to come into power, and when they have the chance to take the reins and try to control those institutions, they are going to be perhaps not as destructive and corrupt and maladaptive as their predecessors, but they're certainly going to lead us down a dark, destructive, apocalyptic road of their own. And so that is a reality that's very difficult for people to face. But if you want the proof of that, you can go to any political rally. You can see how many ignoramuses there are in the audience. You can see how superficial and shallow, and you can see how they are stumbling in the dark. And that raises questions about our ability to make immediate change. It doesn't say we can't make change in the future, but it does say that the hope that a benevolent president will solve all our problems, that's just divorced from reality.
Yes. And I think you actually hit the nail on the head, because I was going to merge what you were saying about noticing our own faults with noticing our candidates' faults or our political party's faults or whatever, because that's something that people seem unable to do. They get so latched on to a person or a politician or a party instead of the ideas that those people or parties are supposed to represent. I think if we want true change, we have to embrace ideas. We have to embrace liberty. We have to embrace freedom of speech, freedom of expression. We need to actually care about something that is objective, that doesn't change, And if people and politicians are willing to support those, then okay, we'll support you. But instead, what's happened is we've got people who support subjective politicians, and if they change what their opinions are, their supporters don't care. They're like, oh, okay, well, I'll go with them. So, for example, I think something that was very revealing about a lot of our progressive candidates was the CARES Act and how many people voted for it. You've got Bernie Sanders, who claims to be this extremely progressive person for the people, who's not going to put up with corporate bailouts and our taxpayer money going to giant companies. And then he voted for that bill. And, rightfully so, a bunch of people jumped on him for it. But then, since I used to be a Tulsi Gabbard supporter like you were, once Tulsi came back into the scene to vote, she voted for the HEROES Act. She voted for the Trace Act. She voted for, a bunch of stuff that all of her supporters, if you had asked them point blank about the bill without saying who had voted for it, they would have been like, oh, no, that's terrible. Of course I wouldn't support that. And then once they find out that their candidate voted for it, then they're like, oh, okay, well, now that you look at the bill, there's this part that looks this way, and maybe this is, and they start trying to explain it away. And, that is I'm doing everything I can to fight against that because that's so dangerous. Once you lose objective truth in your search, then you're not looking for anything anymore. If you just have a bunch of moving chess pieces that you're going after, you're never going to achieve anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, the problem, it sounds like you're talking about the cult of personality in American politics, which is a form of demagoguery. It's certainly compatible with Nietzsche's observation, public opinion's private indolence. You're allowing somebody else to speak on your behalf because you're too lazy to do the research. This is something that occurs in many facets of American culture. Not just with politicians, but if there's an issue that comes out, people will say, I don't know how I feel about this particular issue. Let me see what Reed is saying about this, or let me see what Dack is saying about this. Let me see what Jimmy Dore is saying about this. All three of these guys feel the same way about this issue. Therefore, I am going to echo their opinions. Right. Now, politically, in terms of seizing upon this personality rather than the politician, this is the inevitable outcome of our culture of narcissistic individualism. And it's also a byproduct of superficial thinking. I mean, try to ask people, was George Washington a conservative? Was he a progressive? Was he a libertarian? People can't answer that question. All they can tell you is that he was a great man. But his political philosophy remains a mystery. These statues to Confederate soldiers that are being taken down, what exactly did those men evince philosophically or intellectually that justifies their veneration in the modern day? Nobody can answer that question. All they can say is that they were great men. Well, that doesn't mean anything at all. And with these politicians, we see how people are gravitating towards a personality, a persona, or a two-dimensional character in an equally two-dimensional political melodrama. That, of course, is the reason why Donald Trump was elected. And we see that with many of the people in the Democratic Party. I mean, Bernie Sanders is known by the style of his hair. He becomes, as I just said, a character. And you can see how people are gravitating towards these politicians, referring to them by their first names. Bernie, Tulsi, Kamala, Beto, even Hillary. I mean, you name it. You see this really superficial personification of the political process. And that is why people like to take pictures of themselves with politicians. Cory Booker loved to take selfies, and then his supporters use their selfies as their profile pictures on Twitter. You can see that it's all about the persona, the individual, the man or the woman. It has nothing to do with political philosophy. It has nothing to do with principles. It has nothing to do with integrity or the expression of ideas. And even here, many people have said that they don't like me as a commentator, but it has nothing to do with my ideas. They're frequently saying that they don't like the tone of my voice. They don't like my tenor, my negativity. Sometimes they even say they don't like the size of my penis. And that has nothing to do with the power of my ideas. It's just because I don't have a very good personality. Last thing I'll say about this, Marianne Williamson, when I asked her about Julian Assange, she said that she recognizes that much of her inherent reflexive hatred of him comes from a rather senseless disapproval of his personality, and it is not based on any kind of analysis of his work. So in the political spectrum, we can't say that we're becoming more thoughtful over time. People are becoming more and more superficial. Why else would they say vote blue no matter who?
Right. Yeah, no, I think you're spot on with what you said there. So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about this, because you were definitely a Tulsi Gabbard supporter, but you've become kind of a renowned Tulsi Gabbard critic, I'd say a lot of her supporters would call you. And in some ways I have too. I think I've called her out on a lot of stuff that she's done since she dropped out of the race. She seems like a different person now. She was pushing for certain ideas before she dropped out, and I don't know if it's because of COVID-19 or I don't know what the cause is of her sudden switch. I don't know if she feels like she's just got to do the right thing and get behind the party. I want to think she's benevolent. I just think she's misinformed. But there's definitely been like
being is benevolent.
Yeah, I want to think that she's, I don't know what the right word is. She's
well-intentioned.
Yeah, she's doing what she thinks is right. I don't think she's like purposefully become a traitor or something. But in any respect, she's definitely changed, and I've been really disappointed but I just wanted you to kind of flush out like what you think about that whole situation and just.
Well, I mean, before we started filming this video, I said that I had made a stance that I was not going to initiate controversy with her supporters. I'm not looking, because I don't really have a problem with her supporters, despite what I myself have said on Twitter. My issue is with this attempt to justify the person rather than the philosophy. I mean, as I said, I'm going to be writing a book about the campaign, and I will explain my ideas in greater detail there. But the issue, as I see it, is that you can see that the cult of personality has endured, that there are people who are invoking her with these protests that are taking place across the country, the Black Lives Matter issue. They are posting pictures of her and saying, imagine if we had this woman as president, everything would be perfect. I think that that is a terribly naive and rather romanticized vision of what the Gabbard administration would be. People, it speaks of naivete, but the thing is, perhaps what defines my approach to the Gabbard campaign is that I always understood from the very beginning that she stood absolutely no chance of winning. I mean, I knew before I ever met her, that the Democratic Party and the corporate media and the military-industrial complex would not allow a person of her views to get the nomination, much less the presidency, because I had been through what happened with Ron Paul. You did too, and I thought that many of her supporters did too. Like, I remember Eric Jackman had reached out to me because he appreciated the fact that I was a former Ron Paul supporter who gravitated towards Gabbard. But the thing is, all too many of her supporters are ignorant of what happened with Ron Paul, probably because in 2012 their mentality was, ew, icky Republican, I don't want to look at him. And no matter how repulsive you may find his views to be, the fact is that the man was sodomized by the corporate media in much the same way that Andrew Yang was. And so I knew that Tulsi Gabbard had no chance of winning. And because I don't like to say I had a pessimistic view. I like to say that I had a realistic view of her campaign. I also had a certain set of expectations, which was that she wasn't going to behave as if she had something to lose within this party. And her endorsement of Joe Biden, I mean, she hasn't exactly broken her back campaigning on his behalf like Bernie Sanders has, which is why I've tried to back off of my criticism of her in recent weeks, because my view is that if voting really is a waste of time because these institutions are irredeemable, then scolding people for supporting Tulsi Gabbard is probably as fruitless as scolding people for refusing to vote for Joe Biden. And I've recognized that, and I've thought about that, and I'm going to continue to ruminate on that. But in the context of this particular election, it shows that she wasn't as forceful or as pointed a critic as I was looking for, which is why I've made the decision that I need to get away from these politicians and these political campaigns and turn towards literature, which is ultimately where I belong. I'll say this: the Charles Booker campaign down in Kentucky. You saw how excited people were getting when it appeared that he was going to displace, I don't even know her name. Is it Amy McGrath?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. People were getting so hyped up for that. And I just said to myself, it doesn't matter, because even if he gets the nomination, the Democratic Party's machine will take over and allow Mitch McConnell to remain in power because he's such an effective villain. And lo and behold, as soon as we don't even know if Charles Booker actually lost, it could very well be that ballots were destroyed. But however Amy McGrath defeated him, quote unquote, Charles Booker immediately turned around and proved that he wasn't all that different from Cory Booker. And he said, we need to focus on defeating Mitch McConnell. And, the frivolity of these campaigns. All I can say is this: I'm not saying that I'll never vote again, and I may even vote for a Democrat in the future. But this is the last time that I try to get a Democrat to achieve any kind of success within the party system. I'm not going to be wasting any time trying to get that person to qualify for debates, because I can see that it's all a lot of pomp and circumstance. I mean, it doesn't really mean anything. It's just a waste of time.
So You and I have high standards because we were Ron Paul supporters, and as you mentioned, he didn't sell out. He stuck true to his values. He didn't endorse McCain. He didn't endorse Romney, and I don't think he ever jumped on board with a bill that didn't fit his perspective. He was never like, okay, we've got to be, we've got to come together to defeat the Democrats on this bill. If it was a Republican bill, he would just be, and it didn't align with his views, he just wouldn't vote for it. So we're used to someone like that. So when we get someone like Rand Paul or Tulsi Gabbard or, any of these guys who just kind of, end up folding when it really matters and going with the status quo, we get angry. And I do too. What I think, though, is that people like Rand Paul, Tulsi Gabbard, even Bernie Sanders sometimes, or Mike Lee, like when these people stand for issues that we agree with, if they're going to stand to be against a war, or they're against some ridiculous spending bill, or they're against, the Patriot Act, regardless of how they let us down, I think we should still try to, I don't know how to say it, maybe not, I think it's bad to to turn a blind eye when they do something bad, but I think it's good to try to support them when they do things that matter. So not to completely write them off because they do stuff like this, but because I think canceling them completely is just as bad as, what their supporters do by just acting like there's nothing wrong with them at all. I think it's like the same.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, 100%. I mean, earlier this summer I finished reading the first half of Mein Kampf, and I'm going to read the second half as the Democratic National Convention takes place, because it's important to understand what's going on. And the thing is, or what Hitler had to say, it's important to recognize that. And so the idea of cancel culture, I've never once been a fan of cancel culture. All I've said about the Gabbard campaign is that she did betray her supporters when she did that about face and tried to persuade people to vote for Joe Biden. And I don't want to talk about the pledge. People know what I'm talking about when I say that the pledge does not mean that she has to give a gushing emotional endorsement of the man. And hell, why don't we challenge the pledge that she signed by refusing to vote for him, and we'll see what the Democratic Party actually does about this. Something tells me the Democratic Party would not pursue anything if she refused to support him. Especially because her reputation has been tarnished by, you guessed it, the Democratic Party. And I have tweeted out things in support of Tulsi Gabbard since then. I mean, I've said that when there was a lot of jingoism surrounding the Amy McGrath campaign, and I pointed out that Tulsi Gabbard didn't get the same benefit of the doubt with her military service. I was accused of being a Bernie bro because when Bernie Sanders was getting sodomized around Super Tuesday, I pointed out that the Democratic Party was being insincere with this. Just because I think Bernie Sanders is a traitor to his cause, and I think he's a sheepdog for the Democratic Party, that doesn't mean he's wrong about literally every single thing he ever said. There are things that Nietzsche wrote that I find idiotic. I mean, his misogynistic polemics, they don't even make sense. I don't have to agree with every single thing a person says. People depict me as some kind of intolerant Procrustean, but that's not who I am. I mean, I saw the endorsement of Joe Biden as a particularly poignant betrayal. And for the record, there are many of her supporters who agree with me, but they're just afraid to speak out about it because they know that they're going to be getting the brush of the brunt from her impassioned fan base. And so I think that what I've learned, because I had a very long interview with Mike Gravel where we talked about Bernie Sanders' shortcomings, and he tried to defend Bernie Sanders to me, is that Twitter is obviously not a very good means of communication, especially for the expression of real serious ideas. You have to read books. You have to read blogs. You have to listen to people at length. There's an interview that Julian Assange did with Afshin Rattansi for RT, wherein he spoke for about 45 minutes about the emails that were released as part of the DNC leak 4 years ago. That full 45-minute interview is endlessly fascinating to me, and yet the primary criticism of it is that it's too long and people can't pay attention to it. So what I've learned from the Tulsi Gabbard campaign is that you have to really dig beneath the surface. this. You have to actually entertain ideas at length. I mean, consider the length of this video that we're doing right now. This isn't something that can be boiled down to a 30-second soundbite, because no matter which part you select, it's going to misrepresent our views. And so I'm coming to see Twitter. I think that Twitter is important or it's effective as a news source. I like to go on there and see like things that aren't being discussed in the corporate media, such as police brutality amidst the Black Lives Matter protest. But I don't think it's an effective means of intellectual expression, which is, of course, why fools like Seth Abramson have selected it as their medium of choice, because they have nothing to say.
Right. I think you touched on a couple things there. One is that something we were talking about earlier, the idea of embracing ideas instead of people, and digging. I like what you said about digging beneath the surface, because a lot of people are into surface. And before we did this video, we were talking about how a lot of Trump supporters supported Tulsi Gabbard, and that's a surface thing. I mean, if you start digging into it, it doesn't really make any sense. But a lot of people, they see someone who's patriotic, who's tough, who's, taking on the mean bad guys, and like that's enough for them. They don't need to dig any deeper than that surface. And once you have someone who's like that, like Donald Trump, then he can completely betray everything that he says he's going to do, and you're going to have a rabid group of followers that don't care, because the surface was all it took to pull them in, and that's all it takes to keep them. So as long as he keeps his bravado of patriotism and toughness, he can govern however he wants, and they won't care. I mean, can you imagine if Barack Obama banned bump stocks or threatened martial law or said that we should imprison people for burning flags? I mean, can you imagine how the Republicans would react if Obama had said that? I mean, there'd be riots from Republicans everywhere. But Donald Trump does it, and it's all good. Or if we had, if Obama had said that we need to print off checks and give them to Americans, or, that we need to, if Obama had the deficits that Trump had right now, like all these things they're completely opposite of what these people say they stand for. But because they only care about surface level optics, that's all it takes to keep them hooked in. You know what I'm saying?
Well, when was the last time you heard anybody in the media, even the independent media, talk about the U.S. national debt? I mean, I don't even know what the United States national debt is, because it's not discussed like it was 8 years ago. But that's the point, is that back in 2012, if the Republican Party had been serious about opposing Barack Big Government Obama, they would have nominated Ron Paul, and we would right now be talking about the end of Ron Paul's second term. As hard as that is to believe, that is where we would be right now. But of course, they didn't do that. They felt it was necessary to nominate Romney Care. And here we are. This is the complete abandonment of principles, which is exactly what the Trumpish age is all about. The Trumpish age is about this Alice in Wonderland type inversion of political principles, which reveals that we have none, because Americans have been so superficial in their political analysis hitherto. I mean, I haven't really followed any political media, even independent media, in the last several months, because I don't think people have the capacity to process what is happening right now. And in the case of trying to understand where we're going to go with this, I'm preferring to read books and watch films that were produced some time ago, because I think it provides us with a certain, I think it gives us a kind of threshold to say, okay, what were people thinking at least 20 years ago, and what are they thinking now? You can see that people are caught in this historical maelstrom from which they are unable to escape, because there are these forces conspiring against them over which they have such limited control. Tolstoy wrote about that very eloquently in War and Peace. And so it gets reduced to a very simplistic political objective, where we say we need to get Joe Biden into office, or we need to maintain the Trump presidency because Donald Trump has thrived as some kind of ineffable political symbol. I mean, clearly he has no established political ideology. His supporters, I mean, can you imagine Republicans supporting WikiLeaks back in 2010 after video evidence emerged of war crimes committed by the American military? I mean, and yet they support him for the moment. And then this case with Roger Stone, how many of these people who love Roger Stone or hate Roger Stone even knew who he was before the year 2016? Right. I mean, it's this. It's not, again, as you said and as I said earlier, it's not about ideologies, it's about personalities. Where do you fit in the morality play that is the modern political culture? Are you a good guy or are you one of the villains?
Yeah. I like what you said about reading books, because if you were to ask people about the situation we're in right now and you took the labels away, you took Democrat, Republican, Trump, Biden, whatever, CDC, you took all these labels away and you described this exact situation and you said, what would you do? Their answer might be completely different than what they're actually doing, or from their answer if you had all those labels in place, because they don't think objectively. They think this is good, so I have to go with this. This is bad, I have to be against this. So the circumstances they're in don't matter. It's all about, kind of like you said, what does Reid think? What does Dack think? What does Jimmy Dore think? What does Trump think? That's just, that's supreme. So that's like one of my huge goals. And I think that's one of your goals too, is to get people to pull back and think about the situation they're in and realize the decisions they're making. And, if you put them in the book 1984, or if you put them in Germany in the 1930s, to get them to realize, like, you are this guy right here. You're doing what this guy's doing, but because of this label, you don't think that's what you're doing. You think you're on the right side. And that's exactly what caused the guy in this book, or caused this guy in history, to think he was on the right side, because the label was on his side.
Well, focusing on the immediate inevitably leads to failure. I mean, Franklin Pierce, the only president born in New Hampshire, he didn't feel that slavery was such a significant issue that the country needed to go into civil war over it. And his myopia resulted in him being remembered as one of the worst presidents in American history, a president so terrible that we can't even understand what exactly was wrong with him. My interest in classical literature as a kind of barometer for where we are in the present day actually began in the 2012 campaign, because Mitt Romney had warned that America was at risk of going the way of France did after the 19th century, where it ceased to be the leading force of the world. If you read Les Miserables, which I understand is a melodramatic novel, but nevertheless, it exposes many of the problems with French society in the 19th century, where despite the incredible amount of wealth that the nation had, there was still widespread poverty, immiseration, a broken criminal justice system, you name it, all of the same problems that we have today. The only difference is that those people didn't have smartphones. And so you can see that we, in this historical continuum, we, as I said a moment ago, we can't see the forces that beset us. This is why I made a rule to myself recently that when I'm reading works of political literature, I will not read anything that was published within the last 10 years. 2 years ago, I decided to do that. I read Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was incredibly germane to the controversy about child separation or family separation down at the Mexican border. I read Atlas Shrugged, which had a great deal of, it wasn't a good book, obviously, but it was interesting to read the conservatives' paranoia about where society was heading with its emphasis on altruism. And I read, most importantly, Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail 72, where Richard Nixon, a supposedly extremely vulnerable Republican incumbent, ended up wiping out his Democratic challenger in the general election. And I'm not saying that Donald Trump is going to crush Joe Biden. On the contrary, I think Trump is more vulnerable than people think. But it was fascinating to see the similarities in the Democratic primaries of almost 50 years ago compared to what is happening today. You can see that history tends to repeat itself. And you're not going to get that from a Jimmy Dore video. You're not going to get that from Kyle Kulinski, because most of these people probably, I'm not talking anything about Jimmy Dore, but most of these people do not read, because reading is not fashionable. Reading is not going to get you more likes and clicks and shares. You have to have integrity You have to have discipline. And that is something that this internet culture sadly does not foster.
Right. So I wanted to ask you your opinion of what's going on with COVID-19,
Sure.
with shutting down the economy,
Yeah.
with, are you worried more about the disease or more about civil liberties and economic deprivation? Do you think it's been way overblown? Like, just kind of tell me what you think about the entire situation, like what's been done wrong, what's been done right.
I'm not a doctor, so I recognize my own ignorance on the subject, and I say that my medical opinion of coronavirus disease 2019 is absolutely worthless. However, this is what I say. I have a hardline stance on this that even the trumpeters refuse to endorse. I do not believe that the American government should have the right to put 320 million people under house arrest. I do not care if it's the bubonic plague. And the reason I say that is because once you give the government the license to do such a thing, you give the government the license to put its entire population under house arrest for any number of supposed threats, real or imaginary, real or fictitious, real or designed, real or propagandized. And so in this case, I have no objection to the government requiring people to wear masks in public, or a business requiring people to wear masks in public. But this is what I'll say. Because I take that hardline stance, I do not agree with the government forcing all of these businesses to shut down. However, if the businesses are going to be compelled to shut down, then obviously you have to compensate people for their income, which is a massive governmental expenditure. I believe you and I had a brief exchange on Twitter about this recently, where you said that the compensation for people who are out of work should come from the state government rather than from the federal. I would disagree only because the federal government is issuing these guidelines, and then the state is kind of the state has its hands tied, basically. It either ignores the government regulations or it follows them and puts people out of work. But the problem is this compensation that the government has provided has been woefully inadequate for untold numbers of people. And so because of that, you have a perfect storm of political and economic dysfunction that is the recipe for revolution. I think that the American people are much too lazy to seize that opportunity. And of course, since the FBI has already been in my home once, I'm not endorsing revolution. But at the same time, you can see that the grotesque and shocking and inexplicable incompetence of the government is giving people every possible incentive to revolt. Now, I have to take the hardline stance and say the government should not be getting involved in any situation, because if you say that the government is allowed to put everyone under house arrest as long as they provide appropriate financial compensation, then you're opening the door for a future scenario wherein the government can say, all right, we're going to put everyone under house arrest, but this time we're not giving the financial compensation. That's the problem here. So that's my particular stance. Without making any assessment of the lethal threat posed by the disease itself.
Wouldn't you say that we've already crossed that threshold of knowing that the government can get away with a lot now? I mean, this disease, I don't know what the exact number is, but I think it's still below 1% death rate, like far below 1%. And the government could completely paralyze, the entire country with fear, to the point that you were having people, call the police on their neighbors for going outside without masks, and, mass hysteria. To me, what has been way scarier than the disease is the realization of how gullible and helpless Americans are, because not only are they completely dependent on their government for security, but if it's food, if it's anything that you need to live off of, they're completely inept. They don't know how to take care of themselves. They're just so dependent. And so if the government ever really wanted to completely take over more than they already have and just run our lives, have cameras in our houses, just do whatever they want, all they'd have to do is come up with an even more serious threat than COVID-19, and everyone would just fall in line, and whoever doesn't fall in line would just be ridiculed as an idiot, and there would be no resistance, pretty much.
If your audience is mostly libertarian, here's a statistic for them that they might want to keep in mind. The Black Death, which occurred almost 700 years ago, wiped out 75 million people in the world at a time when the population was much, much smaller than it is today. That was about 20% of the world's population. That's a conservative estimate, by the way. Is there any indication that without these social distancing procedures, COVID-19 would have wiped out 75 million people? And even if it had, that again would not be comparable to the Black Death because, again, as I said, the world population is so much larger today. Whitney Webb said in her first interview with Tim Dillon a couple of months ago, at least I think it was her first interview, she said that COVID-19 is the new invisible enemy. And in many ways, COVID-19 is a more effective enemy than terrorism or a foreign nation because COVID-19 does not have a spokesman. COVID-19 does not have a representative government. If you try to say that Iran is doing something malicious, then the Iranian government can step forward and say, you see, this is incorrect. COVID-19 does not have that. So COVID-19 is a more effective boogeyman for the American people or for people in any country. And that's why they're willing to go along with this. That's why they're willing to buy into this. Now, we've seen throughout the years, Edward Snowden publishes his shocking revelations about what these tech companies are doing. The tech companies are caught lying about it, and the public reaction is just to shrug and move on. Nobody even cares. Even if people don't see Edward Snowden as a terrorist, they don't have a problem with the government looking into the nude selfies that we're sending to our significant others. And so the American people are so complacent, so lethargic, and so cowardly that, of course, they're not going to react. I mean, this to me proves a point that I had argued about quite some time ago. I don't think the Democratic Party is actually interested in repealing the Second Amendment because I don't think the American government has any reason to fear its citizenry rising up and revolting. I mean, if the senselessness of COVID-19 has proved, and the government's response to it has proven anything, it is that the American people are far too lazy to rebel.
Right.
Maybe they don't want to rebel. This is something that the Italian filmmaker Pier Paolo Pasolini was talking about back in the 1970s before he was assassinated by the Italian government. He said that the Italian people were culturally, in many ways, just as decadent as the American people, and they were unwilling to rebel. This has given us every reason to rebel, yet we refuse to do so. Will there ever be a time where we would rebel? Probably not. So what does the government care if we're armed to the teeth?
That's a very valid point. Yeah, so we're probably coming up on a pretty good time to start closing out here, but I want to thank you for coming on. That was a very insightful conversation, and I just want to give the last word to you if you want anyone to follow you on Twitter or follow your YouTube channel, if you just want to say anything about what you're doing.
Yeah, I had a complete mental breakdown because my cat had run away, and for 3 weeks I was looking for the guy, but I finally brought him back, which is why I haven't been writing very much. It's why the Overwritten report that I do with my girlfriend Christy Doff hasn't really been doing anything. It's just been gathering dust. But I'm about to mount my furious comeback. You can follow me on Twitter at Dack. Hopefully you include the link here because I'm sure people can't spell that. I'm frequently also on Big Talk, Little Talk, which airs live on Friday evenings with Israel Daily and a cast of other interesting characters. And we tend to talk about things. Overwritten.org is where I post my blogs, although I haven't written much in the last month. But with the Democratic National Convention and the Republican National Convention just around the corner, something tells me I'm going to have some provocative ideas pretty soon.
All right. Well, I really want to thank you for coming on, Dack. Great to have you again.
Thank you.